So, does Matthew Whitaker need to recuse himself or not? Is there a case, if in your understanding of how the ethics office would work, you assume they would make a recommendation for recusal?
So I don't know of any previous attorney general or senior law enforcement official who has an extensive record of comments on a particular case, criticizing the particular investigation, and, by the way, who ran the campaign of a witness in that investigation who has not been expected to recuse. I would never say this situation demands recusal. What it demands is that he submit it to the ethics people and that he should follow the advice of career professionals, as Jeff Sessions did. I do think the likely result of that would be a recommendation to recuse.
Regardless of whether he gets that recommendation, whether he takes it or don't take it, and I was told we probably wouldn't find out unless until he ever testified in front of Capitol Hill. You would assume at some point some Judiciary Committee is going to drag him in front of there while he's in office, unless they get rid of him before the end of the year. But you say it doesn't matter. Explain why you think the Mueller probe now is too far along for anybody to essentially stop it.
Well, so first of all, Bob Mueller has been very strategically smart in spreading pieces of the investigation around different parts of the department. And so, for example, today the Wall Street Journal had a major story about the Michael Cohen investigation. That's not Bob Mueller. You know, the last
District of New York.
That's the Southern District of New York. The last two indictments that we saw on Russia-related campaign interference, Maria Butina and Elena Khusyanova, both of them not Bob Mueller, right? And so you actually can't fire your way out of this problem if you're the president. And so that's reason number one. Reason number two is that, you know, squelching an investigation in its crib is one thing. Squelching an investigation that is very far advanced, that's brought a bunch of indictments, and that has gotten guilty pleas and has a bunch of cooperating witnesses, and even, according to a lot of reporting, is writing its final report. What you're really talking about is squelching a report. And that is going, if you try to do that, it is going to sit there and haunt you and haunt you and haunt you. The political uproar about what is in that report that you're squelching, eventually Congress is going to get it.
Well, and at this point, with the Democrats in charge of the House, they have plenty of subpoena power to do that.
Yeah, so you are playing into the hands of an opposition Congress if you do that, and I think eventually you're going to lose that fight.
Is it possible that Whitaker's just to be there just to be Trump's eyes and ears? And that may be really what this is about?
Sure. It is possible that his major role will be that of somebody who feeds information about the investigation to the White House. That would be monumentally inappropriate if he played that role.
Right.
But it is possible. Look, it is also possible that he is going to get briefed on this investigation. He's sworn an oath of office to preserve and protect the Constitution. That stuff is disciplining. You know, when you go through that, and he's said a lot of, you know, you can be a crazy MAGA conspiracy theorist on CNN, of course, not on MSNBC, but on CNN, you can do that. But then you go into government and your role is a little different. And I actually do hold out possibility that he will be a different person than the one we've seen on CNN.
And there's no evidence that as a U.S. attorney he was anything other than somebody who followed procedures.
I have never heard a particular set of admiring words about his service as U.S. attorney.
Okay.
On the other hand, he was not a lawless individual. He was not somebody that I know to have squelched investigations. And so I think there's reason to, you know, I don't know if he deserves the benefit of the doubt, given the set of things that he's said and his conduct so far. But I do think we should at least consider the possibility that he may rise to the occasion.
Yeah, you got to wait. That's what I've been telling people. Wait to see what he does.
Yeah.
You know, before assuming the worst. Jeff Flake says he and Chris Coons, he plans on bringing up their bill that would supposedly protect Mueller. Mitch McConnell said something interesting going, he's going to be a very, very short-term acting attorney general. We expect that. Is that McConnell's way of saying, I don't want to bring this thing to the floor?
Well, I think that may be McConnell's way of signaling to the president, you need to nominate
Hurry
somebody
up
for
and do
this
it.
position.
Yeah.
Look, the importance of the Mueller protection legislation is not whether it passes or not. That Trump will not fail to act against Mueller if he means to do it because Congress passed the law. The point of it is the signaling of seriousness about this matter by Congress. And if the Senate and the House signal we care about this, we will act about this, that is a constraint on the president. The willingness to pass it is much more important than the significance of the actual legislation itself.
All right. Ben Wittes of Lawfare, you have a George Conway piece. You have a George Conway piece.
George and I wrote a
George Conway writes with a lot of people these days.
Yeah, but his first public writing was on Lawfare.
Fair enough. And this piece about the constitutionality of the Mueller probe.
Indeed, everyone should read it.
It's very interesting. Ben Wittes, thanks very much. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.